July 2, 1944. Normandy. Near La Cam, the hedgerows stand like dark walls in the wet heat, and the air carries two smells that never fully leave a field hospital: dust turned to paste by trucks, and antiseptic fighting a losing battle against blood. A line of ambulances and trucks coughs to a stop. Canvas flaps snap. Stretchers slide out. Inside the 45th Evacuation Hospital, an American installation built to keep men alive long enough to be moved rearward, work is measured in minutes and gauze. And then, among the wounded and the captured, there are women. German nurses, Red Cross personnel and Kriegsmarine auxiliaries, brought in after the fall of Cherbourg. They arrive under guard, not as symbols, but as exhausted human beings carried by the same war that has already swallowed so many. Their uniforms, once meant to signal protection, have not protected them from the simple arithmetic of artillery and collapse. Their hands, trained to dress wounds, now tremble under the reality of having their own injuries judged by enemy medics. This moment matters because it is one of the quiet places where ideologies meet the body. In the summer of 1944, the Nazi state still tells its people that surrender to Americans means humiliation, vengeance, and captivity without mercy. Many Germans have lived long enough under total war to believe it. On the other side, American soldiers, raised on hard training and harder battles, are told to defeat an enemy whose propaganda calls them soft, decadent, weak. But here, under canvas and electric bulbs, the war becomes smaller than flags. It becomes about hands, instruments, water, and the rules that decide whether a captured person is treated as a human being or as spoil. The German nurses likely expected a familiar pattern that Europe had already shown them: a victor who takes, not gives; a captor who punishes, not heals; a medical station that sorts people by nationality before it sorts by survival. They had reason to fear. They had seen what happened when states decided some lives were worth less than others. What they experienced instead was the strange shock of American procedure. At the 45th Evacuation Hospital, the captured German nurses were escorted through the facilities by the commanding officer. They were allowed to observe supplies and equipment and to speak with German patients and prisoners of war. They asked, directly and repeatedly, about the care given to Germans, both in England and on the continent, because their own assumptions could not survive the evidence in front of them. The American staff, watching their reactions, hoped they would remember what they had seen and treat their people with the same kindness. That sentence, quiet, almost ordinary, is a kind of battlefield contradiction. It is not how hatred talks. It is not how propaganda speaks. It is the language of a system trying to remain itself even in the presence of an enemy. The wider context behind this is not sentiment. It is doctrine and law. Through most of the war, U.S. policy for enemy prisoners of war was governed by the Geneva Conventions of 1929, particularly the Prisoner of War Convention. In the official U.S. Army Medical Department history, the requirements are laid out with clinical clarity. Prisoners were to be housed with sanitation in mind. Their food ration was to be equivalent to that of base troops. Camps were to have infirmaries, and medical inspections were to occur regularly, with explicit emphasis on hygiene, disease prevention, and medical care. The words sound administrative, but their consequence was intimate. They meant that, at least on paper and often in practice, a German prisoner's wound was not a trophy. It was a medical problem to be solved. Yet there was an emotional contrast in this. For American medics, this was not an easy holiness. These men had seen friends killed by German fire. They had dragged their own wounded out of hedgerows. They had watched the battlefield turn into a machine that ground everyone down. Many would have preferred to reserve every bandage for their own. And still, procedure held. The work of cleaning wounds, washing away dirt, pulling out fragments, cutting dead tissue, dressing the raw edges with practiced speed, does not feel like mercy to the man doing it. It feels like duty. But to the person who expected cruelty, It can feel like an earthquake. If the title says, German nurses cried when U.S. medics cleaned their wounds, the deeper truth is that tears in a hospital are not only pain. They are disorientation. They are the body reacting to a world that no longer matches what the mind was taught to expect. What the German nurses saw when they were walked through the American hospital was not merely kindness. It was abundance, structured, standardized, and repeatable. It was the logistical power to build a functioning medical system in a conquered corner of France while a war still raged. And that abundance had a physical symbol. In this story, let the recurring object be the roll of clean gauze. Not the heroic weapon. Not the flag. Not the grand speech. A simple roll of white gauze, clean, unblooded, plentiful enough to be torn away without hesitation. For soldiers raised in scarcity and blockade, gauze is not just cloth. It is a promise that the next dressing will exist. That infection is not destiny. That a wound does not have to rot because the state ran out of cotton and alcohol and transport. In American hands, the gauze is not rationed as a moral test. It is used because it is there. The historical record shows how this difference in resources and standards could become visible even beyond the battlefield. In the United States, German POW camp conditions, food, sanitary care, and health services were required to match the standards given to American forces. Arnold P. Kramer's study notes that Geneva rules meant prisoners were to receive the same treatment as members of the American armed forces, with regular inspections to ensure it. That same pattern, American standards applied even to the defeated, created friction. The Amid history observes that in places like France and Belgium, German POWs sometimes appeared better fed than nearby civilians suffering shortages, leading to accusations that Americans were pampering prisoners. That anger, too, is part of the story. Because mercy in wartime is never simple. When you treat the enemy humanely, someone else will ask why you did not treat your own first. And still, the system held often enough to become a weapon of its own, one aimed at enemy belief. Now the transformation. The German nurses who arrived at La Cam did not know at first that they were going to be returned to German lines. When they learned it, the account notes they were overjoyed. That reaction is revealing. Overjoyed not only because freedom was possible, but because the outcome contradicted what they had been prepared to believe about the enemy. The Americans did not need to return them. They were valuable captives. They could have been kept, traded, punished, displayed. Instead, arrangements were made for a ceasefire and a controlled exchange. The details are documented with unusual specificity. The nurses were transported in closed WC-54 ambulances to Balleroy, and a short ceasefire was negotiated by radio involving Captain Fred Girk, Captain Quinton Roosevelt of the 1st Infantry Division G2, and Major F. Heron of the 2nd Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion. Around 1800 hours, the women were taken through the lines near Caumont-Televant. Source. This is not rumor. It is the kind of logistical detail that lives in operational memory. Press coverage existed, too. The episode was described in Yank, British edition, dated July 30, 1944, and the same account notes reporting by Don Whitehead, an Associated Press war correspondent. Even the New York Times carried an AP dispatch. More German nurses returned to enemy. 8 taken in underground hospital near Cherbourg, dateline July 9, 1944. The transformation in perception happens in the space between what propaganda promised and what procedure delivered. In a totalitarian system, the enemy is described as a monster because that description is useful. It keeps people fighting when the war is already lost. It discourages surrender. It binds citizens to the regime through fear. But the role of clean gauze, the antiseptic, the orderly ward, and the fact of being returned rather than brutalized, these things speak in a language that ideology struggles to censor. They are evidence you can touch. And that evidence did not exist only in hospitals. It existed in the broader American system of captivity and care. Kramer's figures show that by the end of May 1945, there were 371,683 German POWs held in the United States alone, an industrial-scale custody operation that required housing, feeding, and medical oversight across 141 main camps and hundreds of branch camps. For many prisoners, that experience was one of stunned contradiction. Even decades later, testimony and recollection often return to the same sensations: bread, coffee, sanitation, medicine, ordinary abundance that felt unreal to men coming from Europe's ruin. One modern example of that remembered shock appears in a New York Times essay about POW treatment, describing a former German POW's memory of American white bread and black coffee as the best dinner he had ever had on a long train ride across the United States. Food, like gauze, becomes symbolic. It is not luxury. It is the visible output of an economy and a political order that can produce more than it consumes. But the title you gave is not a food story. It is a wound story. So the symbolic object remains the gauze, because it is democracy expressed as logistics. Impersonal enough to be fair, abundant enough to be shared, standardized enough to be repeated regardless of who lies on the cot. The deeper irony is that American abundance in medicine was not merely a matter of bandages. By 1944, the Allies had begun deploying penicillin at scale, a change so dramatic that it reshaped what a battlefield wound meant. Military historians have documented how penicillin moved from near non-existence to mass availability, with thousands benefiting in the European theater between D-Day and Germany's surrender. The National Archives account of D-Day and penicillin notes that, according to one estimate, penicillin reduced Allied deaths on D-Day by 12 to 15%. Imagine being a German nurse trained in a Europe where infection still killed men after surgery, and then walking through an American facility where the supplies look endless and the wound care looks almost modern. Even without a spoken conversation, the evidence would have felt like a betrayal of everything the regime taught. And that is where the ideological transformation begins, not with speeches, but with care. Not everyone changed. Not every prisoner softened. The record is complicated. But the phenomenon is historically real. Humane treatment could break down the morale of German troops and make them willing, even eager to surrender, as a congressional committee report later argued in the context of POW policy. It is difficult to build a myth of barbaric enemies when your own eyes have watched them clean your wounds. So the nurses are returned. They ride in those ambulances with doors closed, not as prisoners being dragged to an unknown fate, but as medical personnel being moved under a temporary ceasefire. The road runs between hedgerows and ruined villages. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still speaks. Yet the exchange is negotiated, timed, and executed like a grim ritual of civilization within the collapse. In that moment, the roll of gauze becomes more than bandage. It becomes proof that the enemy has rules. And rules, in wartime, are a form of power. Epilogue, because every documentary script must end where the battlefield cannot. War tries to teach a single lesson. That force decides what is real. But hospitals teach a different lesson, quietly, with hands and water and cloth, that values can survive proximity to hatred. The German nurses who cried did not cry because America was gentle in the abstract. They cried because their bodies, wounded and vulnerable, met an enemy who treated them as patients. And that experience, recorded in unit anecdotes, protected by international convention, repeated across camps and continents, carried a message no radio broadcast could fully erase. Freedom is not only the right to vote or speak. In wartime, it can look like a system that still spends its resources on the defeated, even while burying its own dead. It can look like clean gauze unrolled without hesitation. And long after the guns fall silent, the memory of that gauze, white against red, order against chaos, reminds us that abundance is not merely wealth. It is the capacity to remain human when it would be easier to become a weapon.